Welcome. Welcome and thank you for coming out to this great Westwood Cares event. I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight's event and about our speakers. I'm Sean Bevan, the principal of Westwood High School. I'm also the vice chair or co-chair of Westwood Cares, a committee dedicated to providing the community with information and resources around substance use and abuse and related issues. Westwood Cares consists of varied representation from the community, including parents, principals, public safety officials, and town officials. A full list of members is available in the lobby. Westwood Cares aims to bring speakers whose areas of expertise focus on drugs or alcohol or other risky behaviors. We hope to shed light on these topics that can be difficult to address and manage as parents and as school officials. We hope that you will walk away from our events with useful information and with strategies on what to do or where to find additional resources that work best in your family and in your specific circumstances. All of our programming ideas come from surveys that we collect here at our events and from you. So please help us by completing the blue survey that you received as you walked in when you leave here tonight, and we'll use that information for our future events. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I'd like to start by thanking our sponsor, which is Westwood High School's PTO. So a round of applause for the PTO. Additionally, I'd like to thank the other members of the Westwood Cares and the wonderful staff of Westwood Youth and Family Services for their many various contributions they made to organize and promote tonight's event, and several members of the staff at Town Hall, including Christine, who have provided some technical assistance for the instant polling we're going to be incorporating into tonight's event. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to tell you about this first ever feature of instant polling. We will be using handheld devices, so everybody should have one of these. They are very easy to use. If you hold it with the lanyard facing down or hanging down like this, the numbers across the top go 1, 2, 3, 4, and on and on. The answers will correspond to the questions on the slide in front of you. So, and then if everything works just right, which we've done many trial runs and they seem like they're working well, the answers will come up, your answers will come up, and then the correct answer will come up, and we'll have some information to share with you about those answers. Now a little bit of background about our speakers. Each three come from the Boston University School of Public Health and have a specific area of expertise related to tonight's topic. Thank you to Michael, Rich, and Emily for graciously agreeing to come out tonight to share what they know. We'll be hearing from Dr. Michael Siegel first, Dr. Rich Sates second, and Dr. Emily Rothman third. Time permitting, we'll have a brief period of clarifying questions in between each speaker, and then we'll have a lengthier question and answer session at the end. I'll tell you briefly about each presenter in reverse order, and for more information about each, please consult tonight's program, which is floating around. Dr. Emily Rothman is an associate professor at Boston University School of Public Health with secondary appointments at Boston University School of Medicine and in pediatrics and emergency medicine. She's an adolescent health behavior research expert and has authored more than 80 publications on topics related to public health. She's also a mom. Dr. Rich Sates is a general internist and primary care physician and addiction medicine specialist, chair and professor of community health sciences at Boston University School of Public Health, and professor of medicine at BU School of Medicine. His primary areas of expertise and interests are identifying and addressing unhealthy alcohol and other drug use disorders, the use of accurate terminology, and basing approaches to substance use and addiction on science. And then Dr. Michael Siegel Rich is also a dad, and Michael's a dad as well. We all shared our dad and mom stories here a little bit ago. Dr. Michael Siegel is a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at Boston University School of Public Health. During his 22 years at the school, his main areas of research have been in alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Tying these issues together is the presence of powerful corporations that use sophisticated marketing, public relations, and lobbying activities to negatively impact the public's health. In the tobacco arena, Dr. Siegel has examined the impact of cigarette advertising on youth smoking behavior, the health effects of secondhand smoke, and the evaluation of policies to reduce youth smoking and encourage smoking cessation, as well as the use of e-cigarettes. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Siegel. Here, you can just use this one.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to come out and talk tonight, talk to you, and try to answer your questions about this topic. So I called this Everything You Wanted to Know About Vaping and Weren't Afraid to Ask, because we received a bunch of the questions that you had asked, and I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can. And so my part of the presentation will be basically just trying to go through the science, just trying to give you the facts. And what we're going to do first is we're going to kind of give you some questions to assess your current state of knowledge, see what people are thinking now, and then I will try to give you the answers to all these questions. So by the end, you'll know the answers to all of these. So we'll start with the first question. How much tobacco is in a typical e-cigarette or vape cartridge? So there are 4 choices. They correspond to the numbers. So just click the number, either 1, 2, 3, or 4, corresponding to what you think the answer is. So how much tobacco is in a typical cartridge? 1 is about the same as a regular cigarette, 2 is about half, 3 is about 1/10, and 4 is none. Okay. As soon as it looks like everyone's clicked in, we'll advance it and we'll see the correct answer. So it's actually none. I'm not going to talk about this. I just want you to see the answers, and then I'll go through everything after we go through all the questions. How does the peak nicotine level produced by a typical e-cigarette compare with that of a real cigarette? Okay, let's see what the correct answer was. Okay, so there's a lot of overestimates on the peak nicotine level, as well as whether the amount of tobacco. Next question, how does the peak nicotine level produced by a Joule e-cigarette compare with that of a real cigarette? All right, let's see how this one did. So this one, the majority of people got right. There's a big difference between Joule and typical e-cigarettes, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. How many carcinogens are present in the smoke of a typical cigarette? Okay, let's see what we've got. Okay, it's about 60. Most people were pretty close to that. How many carcinogens are present in the aerosol of a typical electronic cigarette? Okay, so these responses are all over the board. And the correct answer is about 1 to 5. And then I believe we have last one. How many carcinogens are present in the aerosol of Vuse, Mark 10, or Blue e-cigarettes? Those are 3 specific brands of electronic cigarettes. All right, so we have a perfect normal distribution here. We'd like to see that pattern. And here the answer is actually none. So it's kind of interesting to see this. I've never done this before with the audience, so it's really interesting to see where people kind of are starting out from. So I'm going to try to go through this, and by the end, you'll understand. My goal is that you'll really understand the answers to this, and that you'll really understand the subtleties, not just the overall picture of electronic cigarettes, but really understand some of the very, very specific details about it. And I guarantee you that within 25 minutes, you will literally be the experts on this issue. You will know more about vaping than pretty much anyone other than anyone who works in the vaping industry or who vapes after 25 minutes. So what is vaping? Vaping is basically the inhalation of aerosol that's produced by heating a liquid through a battery-powered device that typically takes the form of a cigarette-like cylinder or a pen or a larger tube or even a tank. But the key words that I've underlined are inhalation, aerosol. Okay, this is probably something that almost nobody is aware of, is that it's not smoke. What you're inhaling is not smoke, and it's not vapor. These are two of the biggest misconceptions. What you're actually inhaling is what is an aerosol. An aerosol is a bunch of tiny droplets, particles, droplets. So it's similar to a asthma inhaler. When you inhale from an asthma inhaler, what you're inhaling is aerosol. So you're inhaling little droplets. It's a battery-powered device, and the most important word here is actually heating. There's no combustion, so nothing is burning like in a regular cigarette. It's just being heated, and that heat creates an aerosol that the user can then inhale. So this is what it looks like if you looked inside at the anatomy of an electronic cigarette. So typically it has, at one end, it has a battery, which charges it and gives it electrical power. And then you have a heating element, which is sometimes called an atomizer. And that is what heats the electronic liquid. Typically, there's a cartridge that goes into the front end of the device, and that's what holds the liquid, which is sometimes called ELiquid. People who vape regularly call it juice. They sometimes call it e-juice. And that liquid is heated, and that produces an aerosol, which is then inhaled through the mouthpiece.
So Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a Joule device. This is probably the most common one we encounter here at school. I'm going to pass it around. I think you'll probably notice, if you've not interacted with it or seen it before, it's very notably, it looks a lot like a thumb drive and is easily overlooked, I think. I can imagine if you've not seen this before, it's good for you to see it. So I'm going to start it around here if you can go that way, and then pass it around to your fellow attendees.
Okay. Another thing to note about the electronic cigarette is that there is no way for any kind of for the aerosol to escape from this cylinder except through the mouthpiece. So there is not really any such thing as secondhand vaping, like secondhand smoke. When you hold a cigarette, you know that at the end of the cigarette, which is burning, it's releasing smoke. So that smoke gets into the room. Everyone else is breathing from that smoke. With these devices, the only way that the chemicals will get into the air is actually from the exhaled breath of the person who's vaping. So all of those chemicals will go into the person, be filtered through the lung, and then when they take a breath out, it'll enter the air. So it's very, very different than secondhand smoke, because the secondhand smoke is just coming off constantly out of the tip of the cigarette. Okay, how did this even come about? So vaping was actually invented by a man named Han Lik, who's a Chinese pharmacist, and his father had died of lung cancer from smoking, and he wanted to create a device that would help people to quit. And he knew how difficult it was to quit. He was a smoker, had tried all kinds of methods to quit, and was unable to do it. And so he came up with the idea of, let's create a device that is similar to smoking, that delivers nicotine, but that doesn't contain tobacco and doesn't burn tobacco, and therefore it's much safer than smoking a regular cigarette. So the philosophy behind this product, and the reason it was developed in the first place, was to provide a more effective way for people to quit smoking. So that's its purpose. Its purpose, it is a smoking cessation device. It was not designed to be some sort of cool mechanism for youth or young people to be experimenting with. It was designed as a smoking cessation product. And in fact, what are the benefits? There are some benefits to vaping for people who are already smokers. Obviously, for someone who's a non-smoker or who's never smoked before, there's not benefits to vaping. But if you are a smoker, there are benefits, and namely that this is the only product on the market that addresses both the pharmacologic and the physical and behavioral and psychological and social aspects of smoking addiction. So most smokers will tell you that it's not just the nicotine that creates the addiction, it's also all of the physical aspects, holding the cigarette, feeling the mouth sensation, seeing the smoke coming off the cigarette or out of the mouth when you exhale, feeling the throat hit. There's psychological aspects of the addiction, you know, using the cigarette with when you drink coffee in the morning. There's all kinds of habitual aspects to smoking. People do the same thing all the time, you know, even just the way they hit the cigarette pack to get the cigarette to pop out. These are all really habitual aspects of the addiction, and they're important. There's social aspects. People smoke together in groups. So when you put a nicotine patch on or chew nicotine gum, in no way does that simulate the smoking experience. So it's not addressing all of those different aspects. People don't get together and chew nicotine gum in a group, okay? So there's no social aspect to nicotine gum. There's no community of, you know, nicotine patchers. There's no identity to being a nicotine, you know, there's no term like patchers, I'm a patcher, right? But there is a community of vapors. It has become a social activity. There are online forums that you can go to on the internet for, you know, Vapors Forum. So all of these aspects of vaping are what are unique to vaping, which make it much more effective for many people to quit smoking, because it's able to address all of those other aspects of the addiction. Okay, so were e-cigarettes developed by the tobacco industry to try to lure kids into smoking? And the answer is no, because these products were, the tobacco industry had nothing to do with this. The products were introduced by independent e-cigarette companies. However, in 2011, each of the 3 major cigarette companies in the US bought out or created its own brand of electronic cigarettes. So now each of the 3 companies, tobacco companies, Altria, Reynolds American, and Imperial Tobacco, each have their own brand. So Altria has a brand called Mark 10, Reynolds American has a brand called Views, and Imperial Tobacco has a brand called Blue. So we talked about the e-liquid. That's what's heated. What is in an e-liquid? Every e-liquid has the exact same set of constituents. It has propylene glycol and glycerin in any combination, water, nicotine, typically, and then some flavorings. So the only thing that distinguishes one e-liquid from the other is what is the proportion of propylene glycol to glycerin, and then what flavorings are added to it. Those are the only differences between different e-liquids. We have a very good idea of what is in e-liquids. There's not a lot of mystery to this aspect of the vaping product. And just to show you a typical breakdown, so this is an example of a typical breakdown of an e-liquid, the percentages of each of the different constituents. Typically, most of it is either glycerin or propylene glycol. Then you've got a little bit of water, some flavoring, and a little bit of nicotine. And this just shows you the proportions in different types of products. So you can see the blue e-cigarette is, they only use glycerin. They don't use propylene glycol. But the Sky Cig uses a lot more propylene glycol. And so these are the only differences really between these products. And the significance of glycerin versus propylene glycol has to do with things like how much vapor does it produce? Does it give you a throat hit when you're inhaling? Those are the kinds of factors that influences. Now, you may have heard of jouling, which is a term that has just come about. And what is jouling? Jouling is the use of a specific brand of e-cigarette called Joule. And what is unique about the Joule? What's unique about this particular brand is that it uses a nicotine salt that's absorbed rapidly into the bloodstream. And it actually can simulate smoking much better than any other e-cigarette brand on the market. And so it actually creates a hit that a user can feel. Whereas with other e-cigarettes, you don't get that hit. And we'll talk about the importance of that for addiction in a minute. But this shows you the blood concentrations of nicotine. And if you look at the orange line on the top, that's a typical cigarette, a combusted cigarette. And you can see there's this huge spike. So this is the level of nicotine if you measure it in the blood of a smoker or of a person using these devices over time. So you can see within about 2 or 3 minutes, there's this huge spike in the nicotine level in the blood, and then there's this huge decline. It very rapidly declines, and then kind of goes down after that. Whereas in a typical electronic cigarette, that would be the blue at the bottom, and you can see that it goes up a little bit, and then it kind of levels out a little, and it kind of comes down very, very slowly. So you don't get a spike. So for most electronic cigarettes, the user is not feeling any kind of a hit, because it's just, and the peak level of nicotine is only about 1/10 of what you get with a normal cigarette, okay? But look at the Joule, that's the purple. So Joule was specifically designed to try to simulate the nicotine hit of a regular cigarette. So you can see that if you use a Joule e-cigarette, you get this spike, this very sharp increase in the nicotine in the bloodstream, and then a sharp decline. Okay, what distinguishes vaping from smoking? First of all, there's no tobacco. By definition, a vaping product has no tobacco. If it has tobacco, it's not a vaping product. It's not an electronic cigarette. So there is no tobacco in these products. They have nothing to do with tobacco. And sometimes they're called tobacco products, but that's really a misnomer because there is no tobacco in them. There's no combustion. So there's no burning. There's no smoke. And there's no secondhand smoke. Okay, so let's talk about the addiction potential. Vaping has a much lower potential for addiction than smoking, and the reason for that is because of the blood levels that I showed you. What makes smoking so addictive is that you have this huge peak in the nicotine level in the blood, and you feel this hit, and then it drops off rapidly. And it's that drop-off that creates the addiction. Because when you feel this hit, your body feels great, it creates this euphoric feeling, and then all of a sudden you lose that. What is the body going to do? It's going to crave more. I need more. I need to feel that again. And so that's what makes smoking so addictive. And the cigarette companies have perfected that curve. They spent years and years and years perfecting that curve to get that huge spike and to have it drop off immediately. And that's why smoking is so addictive, because as soon as you feel that hit, they've set it up so that it wears off quickly, and you're just left craving another. You need to take another cigarette. Typical electronic cigarettes, not typical, every electronic cigarette except for the Joule, does not do that. It doesn't give you a hit. You don't feel that hit that you feel like when you smoke, okay? You're not getting a fix. It's a very slow rise in the nicotine. It doesn't go very high, and then it kind of tapers off. And for that reason, vaping does not have nearly the addictive potential as smoking, with one exception, and that is the Joule. Because with the Joule, you get that hit. You can actually feel, if you talk to Joule users, they will tell you, yes, I can feel that hit. And it drops off rapidly. So Joule has significant addiction potential, but not pretty much every other e-cigarette that's on the market right now. And in fact, there's survey evidence that shows that there's very little youth addiction to vaping. Most youth who vape do it only occasionally. The average is using it about 4 to 5 times a month, and using it typically only in social situations. What about the health risks? Well, the first thing I want you to note is that there's a huge difference between the health risks of smoking versus vaping. So smoking has more than 10,000 chemicals, of which actually there's more than 4,000 chemicals that we don't even know what they are. There are 60 carcinogens. We know it causes heart disease and lung cancer, and other cancers, and it causes 450,000 deaths a year. Vaping has between 0 and 20 chemicals. There are no unknown chemicals because they've been very, very carefully characterized. There are between 1 and 4 carcinogens present in these products, but it depends on the voltage of the device. It depends on how high you heat the temperature of the e-liquid. The higher you heat it, the more of these unwanted chemicals that are going to get into the aerosol. There are no documented health effects so far. That doesn't mean there aren't any. It just means that we haven't observed them. And so far as we know, no one has ever died from using an e-cigarette. But I also want to add 2 other, oops. Let's see if I can, oh, there we go, okay. So I just want to add 2 other columns here, one for alcohol and marijuana, and just to show you that marijuana has 2,000 to 3,000 chemicals. So it's actually, its profile is much more similar to smoking than vaping is. At least 1,000 unknown chemicals are in marijuana smoke. There are 33 carcinogens that have been identified. We know that there's strong evidence that marijuana does increase cancer risk, causes lung disease, and has mental health effects. And there are approximately 300 people that do die every year from marijuana use. And those are mostly from motor vehicle crashes. So you can see that there's very different risks between vaping and all of these other forms of substance abuse. Okay, so, but what are the health concerns? All right, and I divide these into 3 different areas. The first is just the general safety of the product, and the health concern there is that there have been battery explosions. Not a lot, it's a rare phenomenon, but it can happen. And at the end, I'm going to talk about how to avoid that. In terms of acute health effects, and by acute I mean health effects that can happen right away or within months or a couple years, there's no concern about acute health effects. The concern is about the possibility of long-term health effects. And so the question is, might vaping for many years lead to chronic lung disease or cardiovascular disease or pose a risk of cancer? So you're not going to get sick. You're not going to have impaired health. There's not going to be adverse health effects in the near term from vaping. So if a youth were to vape for a few years, it's not going to cause disease. However, what we don't know is what would happen if someone were to vape for many, many years. If a youth were to start vaping, to get addicted to vaping, and then basically for decades go on to continue vaping, then we just don't know. There's a possibility that that could result in heart disease or lung cancer down the road. We just don't know. So what does this all mean? So it means that basically a youth who's experimenting with vaping during high school is not going to suffer any health effects. So if you're a parent, you have a kid who's vaping, you don't need to worry that they're going to have acute health effects due to the vaping at this point in time. We don't know if long-term vaping increases the risk of heart or lung disease or cancer. We just don't know. So unless a person regularly vapes for decades, the chronic health effects are not going to be an issue, right? Even if a smoker, we don't see smokers coming into the hospital with heart disease in their 20s. We don't see smokers coming into the hospital, 28 with lung cancer. It takes many, many decades, even with something as toxic as smoking, for someone to suffer health effects. And what makes it so dangerous is that people do smoke for many, many years because it's highly, highly addictive. So the real concern for vaping, I believe, is not so much acute health effects, but it's whether or not a youth becomes addicted. That's the danger. The danger is long-term addiction, and especially if it leads to smoking. So the key concerns are how addictive is it, and will it lead kids to smoke? So in terms of its addiction, the average youth, as I mentioned, who experiments with e-cigarettes uses it only about once a week. And the prevalence of frequent smoking among youth is actually 5 times higher than the prevalence of frequent vaping. So we know that smoking is much more addictive than vaping. And as I said, vaping has very little addiction potential because of the nicotine delivery being so poor. The exception is the Joule, which I believe has a high addiction potential because of the nicotine delivery. Does vaping lead to smoking? Well, there were 10,000 teenagers that were studied by CDC, and they were followed up for a year. The number of teens who progressed from vaping to smoking was only 11. This is out of 10,000 kids. And the number of teens who progressed from frequent vaping to smoking was only 2. They could hardly find anyone. So far, the evidence suggests that young people who vape are not going, that's not going to lead them to smoke. That doesn't mean that kids who vape, that there aren't going to be kids who try electronic cigarettes who later try cigarettes. What it means is that it's unlikely that somebody who's never used tobacco, who would not otherwise smoke, is going to try vaping and then suddenly become addicted to vaping, crave more nicotine, and then switch over to smoking and become a smoker. They're really independent phenomenon. Okay. This is data that I think shows pretty convincingly that vaping doesn't lead to smoking. This shows you the rate of e-cigarettes in yellow. You can see over time that there's been an astronomical increase in the number of youth that are vaping, but the youth smoking rates, which are in blue, have continued to decline. So if all these kids who are trying e-cigarettes if that was really leading them to smoke, we would see an increase in the smoking rate. And what you see, in fact, is the opposite. It's almost like an X. As vaping has gone up, smoking has gone down. And so I think what's really happening is that the vaping culture is taking over for the smoking culture. I don't see vaping as leading to smoking. I see it as competing with smoking. And eventually, I think it's going to take over and smoking is going to disappear. Okay, bottom line, what to recommend if you're unsuccessful in convincing your child not to vape. Dr. Rothman, at the end, is going to talk about strategies to try to prevent youth from vaping. But I do want to say a couple of things in terms of what if you're unsuccessful and your child is going to vape. Here's the things I think you should be concerned about. So first, battery safety. Try to get them to use a brand that has UL-approved batteries. So UL is kind of a certification, and the UL-approved batteries are much less likely to have any problems with explosion. So if you can get a UL-approved battery, that's a big plus. Advise your children never to put batteries in their pocket. A lot of these explosions have happened because the batteries, there's a short circuit created. If you have coins in your pocket and the battery touches the coin, that can create a short circuit. So batteries should never be in the pockets. And only use the charging devices that come with the e-cigarette. Every e-cigarette has its own charger, and you can't interchange them. It's like an electric razor. You have to use the charger that came with your device. It's when people start switching out devices and chargers that they get into problems. And some of the explosions have happened in that situation. What about aerosol safety? Try to encourage them to use an established brand, especially the brands that are available at retail stores. Try to avoid online purchases. Those are the companies that are more suspect. The Vuse is probably the safest, but also Mark 10, Blue, Mystic, Logic, and V2. Those are established brands that have been around for a long time. I actually know the CEOs of every one of those companies, and they're clearly the ones that are paying the most attention to the safety of their products. Try to use a early generation device and avoid the late generation mods and tanks. I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. And if possible, avoid Joule because of the potential addiction potential. All right, so this is just to show you that if you look at all of these toxic chemicals, this shows you the level of the chemicals, and you can see that the cigarette brands at the top, there's astronomical levels of all these chemicals. But if you look at blue e-cigarettes, none of these chemicals were detected in the blue e-cigarette. There was no formaldehyde, there were no carcinogens detectable, there was nothing. They couldn't detect any hazardous chemical. The reason I'm showing you this is to show you that it is possible to have a relatively safe cigarette, or sorry, e-cigarette. And there are brands on the market that will give you that, but they're only the ones that I mentioned. They're the ones that have been tested are the Vuse, the Mark 10, and the blue e-cigarettes. All the other brands on the market are suspect because they don't have the heating control that these brands do, and sometimes the temperature gets too high and you do get these other chemicals in there. So if you can encourage your youth, if they're gonna vape, these are the brands that they're better off vaping. And then finally, there are actually 3 generations of vaping products. The first one are Cigalites. They look like cigarettes. The second are the personal vaporizers. They're also often called ego devices, and they look like pens or USB ports. And then the third generation are these advanced personal vaporizers. These are these very large tank-like devices. And those are the ones to avoid. You don't want people using, youth using these devices because those are the ones that have very high voltage and that heat the product to a very high temperature. And most of the times when carcinogens have been detected in e-cigarettes, it's been in those types of devices. Okay, just one final thing. I'm going to let Dr. Rothman and Dr. Sates talk more about how to avoid or how to prevent youth from vaping. But I do want to say that there are 3 things that I think you can do that in my experience, are effective. The first one is to become very knowledgeable about electronic cigarettes. And already by just coming here and hearing about this, you are probably more knowledgeable than any parent in the country or any youth who are using these devices, most youth who are using these devices. But I encourage you to continue to learn about electronic cigarettes. And second is to talk a lot about vaping and to show an extreme interest in this topic. I can tell you that with especially my 13-year-old teenager, but my 16-year-old and 13-year-old, the moment I become interested in what they're doing, they lose interest. Part of the excitement and the fun of it is that, this is something our parents don't know about. That's the great thing about vaping. I think that's part of why it's so popular, because they do it, nobody knows what they're doing. They can do it in the bathrooms, they can hide it, and parents have no idea what's going on. It's great, it's perfect. But as soon as you show interest, and especially if you show knowledge, you know more about it than they do, and you show this extreme interest, I think that can kind of take a little bit of the oomph out of it. And I know with my kids, the moment I get involved, that they lose interest. So I think I've talked for quite a while, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sates at this point. And at the end, we will all come up, and so we'll have time for questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Michael. Just as we transition, which we are going to do on the laptop here, I think it's on the, Danielle, can you maybe help with that? I do want to, Michael, you had brought up points that do make me nervous. I imagine people were sitting there thinking, like, this might make Sean a little bit nervous. I want to make sure people do understand that vaping is not allowed in our building. Kids are not allowed to have it. It's a rules violation for MIA and our handbook. And I'm hoping that people are taking this information in the spirit in which it's intended, which is this is fully transparent information for you as parents to make decisions about how you parent, and that does not change how we govern ourselves here at the school and the standards that we hold kids to. And I think Richard will be sharing information that will expand on some of the information that Michael shared, and as will Dr. Rothman. So you're ready to go, Rich.
Great, thank you very much. Glad to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about vaping and more about how it might relate to other substance use that Mike began to discuss. So nicotine, alcohol, other drug use, and how it might relate to addiction. And I'm focusing on youth, of course. Now, vaping, as you may have seen on one of the slides that Mike showed, is more common now than cigarette use in high school students in Massachusetts. It's about 11% of high school students are currently vaping, meaning they did so in the past 30 days, and 8% say that they smoked a cigarette in the past 30 days. Why are they vaping? They're not vaping to quit smoking. So Mike talked about the ideology, where it came from, that it may have come from a place of wanting to help smokers quit. But that's not why youth are vaping. They're curious, it might taste good, and they perceive that it has quite low risk. And they may be right about that perception, and that's why they're doing it. I maybe disagree a bit with Mike about the data, and whenever you have two scientists in a room, that happens. So don't get upset about that. It's okay. The same study provided a little bit more follow-up. This is the CDC looked at 10,000 youth aged 12 to 17 who never smoked cigarettes. Okay, they never smoked cigarettes, these youth aged 12 to 17. And I'm going to ask you the question, although I'm not going to use the fancy clicker, how many were smoking cigarettes 1 year later? And of those 10,000, only 2% were smoking cigarettes 1 year later. But 19% of electronic cigarette users were using cigarettes 1 year later. So that's a pretty substantial difference. Now, when you have scientists in the room, you have to step back and say, how could 2% versus 19%? Maybe there's something really different between a kid who chooses to use e-cigarettes and one who doesn't. Maybe it's not the e-cigarette that's causing this. And that would be fair to say. Maybe it's not the e-cigarette that's causing it. But the folks who did this study adjusted their analyses for socioeconomics, experience at home, parental smoking, mental health conditions, and a whole long list of other differences that might have explained why a kid chose to use e-cigarettes or not. So this finding is pretty stable, that kids who are e-cigarette users are much more likely than kids who are not e-cigarette users to be smoking combustible cigarettes a year later. So that worries me a bit. And it's for those who are using more than one type of nicotine product. So there's more than one type, right? There's e-cigarettes, there's combustible cigarettes, there's smokeless tobacco, other forms of tobacco. It's about 4 times the risk, basically, of smoking cigarettes a year later if you're using more than one type of nicotine product. And guess what? Most youth who use a nicotine product use more than one type. So we're not just talking about vaping and e-cigarettes. Now, one other thing that worries me is these are not pharmaceutical products regulated by the FDA where you know exactly what's in everything. You can look to see what's in products, and Mike has shown you some great tables that show the detail of what's in some of these products. But if you do a survey of what nicotine is in the liquid that's sold for electronic delivery systems, for e-cigarettes, you may not know what you're getting. You may not know what you're getting because what's on the label may not be actually what's in there. And in this particular study, when the label said 0 nicotine, think about like if you're trying to get decaf coffee, you want to be sure there's really decaf in there. This label says 0, and 91% of the samples that said there was no nicotine had nicotine in them. If the label said 18 milligrams per milliliter, the actual range somewhere from 11 to 27. That's a pretty substantial range. So we don't really know what we're getting. And then there is, Mike mentioned flavorings. And flavorings we don't know. And what Mike said was, of course, absolutely correct, that there haven't been proven cases of disease. But the flavorings include diacetyl and acetylpropionyl and some other flavorings. And these come under rules that are called as generally recognized as safe, GRAS, generally recognized as safe. They're generally recognized as safe when they're in cough medicine and food products that you eat. We don't know what happens when they're made into an aerosol, like in an electronic cigarette. We do know that workers in popcorn plants, where they make microwave popcorn, where they're exposed to inhaling diacetyl, get a thing that's been named popcorn lung. And the fancy word for it is bronchiolitis obliterans. It obliterates their lungs. This has been reported in those workers. And so it raises at least questions for me that something that might be safe because it's okay to eat might not be so safe to inhale. And there haven't been cases that I know of yet with electronic cigarettes, but it does raise at least that worry. Now, I'm going to leave vaping like I promised and get to what's in most electronic cigarettes that people are using them for, and that's nicotine. And nicotine is an addictive drug. We've known that for decades, and all addictive drugs work the same. Heroin, marijuana, or cannabis, or THC rather, alcohol, and nicotine, they all work the same, and they all affect these circuits in the brain. They affect your control, they affect inhibitory control, they affect your motivation, your ability to prioritize memory, learning, and reward. These pathways in the brain they've been there for eons, and they're really important pathways. They remind us to eat so we don't die of starvation. They remind us to have sex so we reproduce the species and don't die out as a species. These are really fundamental pathways. And I would just raise the question that when you mess with these pathways, with anything, including nicotine, that you have to worry about that. Now I'm going to define addiction. Addiction is use, a simple definition is use despite consequences, despite knowing about consequences and having them, and use that's out of control. You can't stop, it's hard to stop, you use more than you intended. All of these things are true for cigarettes, the definitions that I'm talking about, and nicotine, just as they are for other drugs. And kids are in a particular risky situation because their brains are under construction. Their brains are, you know this, right? You see this probably every day. They're under construction until at least age 25. And what we know is that 9 out of 10 people with addiction started using substances before they turned 18. So in the news, we see grown-ups with addiction running into lots of trouble. But it's a pediatric disease. Addiction starts by trying substances in youth and then developing that addiction. 1 in 4 Americans who began using any addictive substance before age 18 is addicted. Nicotine is an addictive substance. Nicotine is what's in e-cigarettes. There's controversy about a thing called gateway drugs, and we wonder, how does addiction start? Why do some people try a substance, whether it be alcohol or THC, marijuana, cannabis, or whether it be nicotine, and they don't develop addiction? Well, smoking may actually play an important role. And I put these 2 facts up here. 90% of those who use cocaine smoked cigarettes before using cocaine. Well, you could say, well, someone who's going to use cigarettes is the same kind of person, maybe has the same risks, who's going to use cocaine. But it turns out that legal drug use, like nicotine and alcohol, precede but not only precede, are in fact associated with later other drug use, like marijuana and other drugs. So I don't want to argue about whether one causes the other. All I'll say is that we observe it all the time, that people who use the legal drugs later are more likely to use other drugs. And so whether it's cause and effect, it's looking like it's cause, and there are some brain pathway explanations for why it might be cause, and that pathway explanation is a thing called priming. Priming has been found in animal studies, and now there's some people data. In animals, it looks like if you give them nicotine first and then cocaine, they have more rewarding experience with cocaine. Don't ask me how we know that animals have rewarding experiences. There are ways that these experiments can be set up. But in people, the data are that when cocaine use precedes smoking, so if you're a kid and you try cocaine first and then you start smoking, 6% develop addiction to cocaine, 6%. But if you start by smoking cigarettes, 20% will develop addiction to the cocaine. So smoking has a particular role. What is it in smoking that's addictive? It's nicotine. What's in e-cigarettes? Nicotine. So I worry about nicotine because use of one addictive substance is related to and may lead to use of another. I can't talk to you about addictive substances and not talk about the ones that are way more important than vaping. And those would include alcohol and marijuana because they're much more common in youth. So 34% of Massachusetts high school students drink. It's half of all seniors. 18% binge drink. That's enough to get you intoxicated on one occasion. That's about a third of seniors in high school. 8% drive after drinking. 20% ride with a driver who's been drinking. Youth who start drinking, and this means take a drink, not a sip maybe at a religious ceremony or something like that, but kids who take a drink before age 15 are 6 times more likely to develop an alcohol use disorder, which is another word for alcoholism or alcohol dependence, later in life if you compare that to kids who wait till age 21 to have a first drink. I'm not telling you what to do with that information. It's an observation that's been repeated multiple times and again adjusted for the other causes for why people might get alcohol disorder. A quick piece on marijuana, about 25%, about 1 in 4 high school students in Massachusetts uses marijuana. That's a third of seniors. And 90% is by smoking. So as Mike pointed out, you'll remember that the carcinogens that might appear related to marijuana use are from the smoking. The smoke in the marijuana is not good. Vaping is an attractive alternative, and while so far we've just talked about vaping nicotine, you can vape tetrahydrocannabinol or THC, cannabis. So you can get a better taste maybe, a more intense effect, a more positive experience, and while the e-cigarettes that contain nicotine can't really be used for marijuana, the third option on Mike's slides where you sort of put the pieces together and you can add the liquid, that's where you could put in liquid cannabidiol or tetrahydrocannabinol, which you'll be able to purchase coming to stores near you in just a few months. I mean, really, you really will be able to purchase that, although you have to be 21, but maybe kids are able to get things from 21-year-olds and use them when they're younger. So now this may actually be safer. It may be safer than smoking marijuana, but it is also unregulated, and it might lead to earlier use of marijuana, which is an addictive substance. In terms of legalization, we actually don't know if more kids are going to use. There's mixed data on that, but there will be more access and normalization of its use, so there's a fair chance that there will be more use. And when there's more use, by definition, there will be more addiction. The more you're exposed to a substance, the more likely addiction will happen. You may not know these numbers, and these are the proportion of people who develop addiction from a substance after using it. These are pretty cool numbers, actually, and they've been reproduced in several studies now. 32% of people who use tobacco will develop addiction. For alcohol, it's only 15%. For cannabis, it's 9%, but not 0%. It's 9%. For cocaine, 17%. Heroin on the far right-hand side, 23%. So the ones that we're concerned about right now in youth would be tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis. Tobacco because of nicotine. Again, reinforcing that nicotine is a highly addictive substance. If you use these data, nicotine is more addictive than other substances, including cocaine and heroin. Why does it happen to some people? I think the big message for why some kids become addicted and others simply try and use and don't develop addiction, the take-home message is it's not one single thing. It's complicated. I wish it was easier. I wish there were one single thing. It has to do with your biology, your family history. If you're a boy, a man, you're more likely. If there are mental health conditions, if you're under a lot of stress, if there are traumatic events that you've been exposed to. But if you have access, if you have easy access, because that risks use and repeated use is associated with addiction. If your parents use, so if we as parents use what we demonstrate and role model, our kids will pick up. And high income. High income is actually a risk factor for addiction. High income and very low income are both risk factors compared to middle income. Things that might protect are things that happen at school, at home, in neighborhoods, and in society. And those include how involved you are with your kids, restrictions that you may put on them, your expectations of them, and I want to mention again, access. So not smoking, because of the nicotine, not smoking and not vaping remain the safest choices. And what can we do about it? And now's a transition to Professor Rothman, who'll tell us a little bit about how to talk to our kids. This is how not to do it. Saying drugs are bad, don't use drugs, is, as Mike suggested, I think, a way to get kids to use drugs. That's the reaction. On the bottom right-hand side is the latest campaign from the U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts. This is a terrible campaign because it will likely not only not reduce drug use, it'll probably increase drug use because it's telling kids, if you use drugs, you will die. They don't believe that. They know they won't die. They're pretty sure they won't die. They know people who haven't died. They want to try and see what everything is going on. So we have better ways to do this. We can role model. We can share our expectations about use. We can have rules and be involved in our kids' lives, encourage activities, check in on them, spend time with them, and we'll talk a little bit more about this now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. I think we might have time or are we ready to go with Emily's presentation now? Maybe we can take one question for Rich. Anybody? You were that comprehensive. You just were so thorough, and there you have it. Okay, so we're going to kick it over to Professor Rothman. Oh, we have one question in the back. Yeah. It's a question about regulation. Maybe we can shelve that for the question and answer session just after Dr. Rothman, and then we'll come back to that as our first question, okay? So, Emily.
Great. Okay, thank you. So, good evening, everybody. I'm Emily Rothman. I'm so glad to have been invited here to talk to you about what we can say to adolescents and what we can do now that we've heard this information if we want to help shape their behavior and steer them towards healthy choices. So I have been researching for the past 17 years, adolescents, why do they do what they do, and how can we get them to stop doing the things that we do not want them to do? My main area of research is dating and sexual violence perpetration, how to get people to be nonviolent, but also have studied substance use, and we find that a lot of the same lessons apply either way. I thought that I would start actually by telling you about a mistake that I made as a parent, because I'm a mom too. My kids are a little younger than yours. They're 11 and 9. But when they were first born, you know, we went out and got sort of every book, and we're trying to, you know, do they cry it out or not cry it out, or, you know, what are we supposed to feed them, or what age you start toilet, all of this stuff, and like, you know, going to looking at magazines. And being a sort of skeptical person by nature and science-oriented, I started noticing that I got very overwhelmed and felt like, well, it's almost like a cottage industry of parenting advice. And so little of it seems to be rooted in actual evidence that I think I started to just give up on all of it. I just felt overwhelmed, and I thought, well, I'm just not going to believe in any of this, because intuitively even I thought, well, we're all different. Our culture varies house to house, or the resources that we have, or the situations that we're in. So how can it be possible that there's one solution, that these advice books are giving me? And then even, in the same house, strategies that work with my older daughter are definitely not going to work with my younger daughter, because she's a completely different person, and our dynamic is different. So to me, I thought, all right, well, nobody must know anything about how to parent, and you just go with your gut. And so, but that's where I was actually wrong, because people have invested a fair amount of money at this point into investigating, and in particular with regard to substance use, how should parents communicate with their children in order to reduce the likelihood that they start using substances or that it's going to develop into unhealthy use. And people may be familiar with this already, but the literature is fairly conclusive that there are parenting styles, and that one of these parenting styles tends to work the best. So at the far end of the spectrum, we have authoritarian parenting. And what that means is very, top-down approach, or very, very strict, and really laying down the law and being punitive, very harsh maybe when people break those rules. At the other end of the spectrum, you have maybe people who are neglectful, not paying attention at all. And one step down from there, you have folks who are what we call permissive or lax. And so that kind of parenting style is those who maybe shrug and say, well, kids will be kids, boys will be boys, but they sort of look the other way. And the style that tends to work the best are those who are authoritative, which means you have a clear sense of the boundaries and the rules, and you put them out there, and then you're not harsh, but you are consistent and firm and communicative about those rules. So that's what tends to work best. And fortunately, so for people who are really interested in, I thought there might be people here who are themselves social scientists or want to do a bit of your own reading, and so we can make sure you get these slides, and there's just a whole deep literature about support for this idea. The other thing that the literature supports, I would say, is the idea that it's okay to be discreet and selective about what you share about your own past with your kids. And for me, this was a little bit of a startling thing to read about in the literature, because when I started my own parenting journey, I think I pictured myself having, a very groovy relationship with my kids where we can talk about anything and it's open and honest and authentic and real. And I also know that there are parents who might be surprised by this because they themselves have struggled with drugs or alcohol, and they get to thinking, well, if I just tell my kids, how hard it was for me, all the problems that I had and what I had to go through in order to quit, then I can save them that pain and effort. If I'm just really honest with them, they can avoid that pitfall. And the literature is conclusive. It's really clear. There's not a whole lot of mixed evidence that it's a good idea to talk with your kids about your own substance use back when you were their age, because what it does is it means that the kids can look at you and say, well, you seem to have come out of it okay, or it was okay for you. And so it doesn't really help accomplish the goal. There are things that parents can do, and what I'm going to try to do really briefly is introduce the topic or the idea of motivational interviewing, which can be a really helpful technique for thinking about talking to your kids. And then also, one thing that we can do is we can sort of sort kids into these three categories and say, well, there are those who've never tried vaping or alcohol or marijuana, whichever substance we're talking about. There are those who have experimented but are not dependent, and then there are those who are already dependent or addicted. And we have slightly different ways of thinking about how you want to talk to or approach each one of those groups of kids. So very briefly, if this winds up being something that interests you, I would encourage you to Google it, and there's lots of videos that you can watch and worksheets, and you can practice. I'm not going to be able to teach it in 2 minutes. But this has been one of the pillars of my own research. When I have done randomized control trials with adolescents to try to get them to stop doing something, we use motivational interviewing, and we've had some success. So I'll just tell you what it is that we do that seems to work. The number one thing, so square one, is the adolescent has to feel like you like them. They have to sense, so if people go to therapy, there has to be that therapeutic alliance between a counselor and a patient. People have to feel like you trust them, you believe in them, you respect that they are rational, autonomous beings who are going to make good choices for themselves. And that can be very hard to do, I realize, especially if you have a teenager in your house who didn't make a particularly rational decision or hasn't impressed you with their ability to make great choices lately. In that case, there's an argument to be made for sort of digging deep and figuring out what it is that you do believe in about them in terms of their capacity to make great choices for themselves. Because square one, if they feel like the conversation is judgmental or about policing and playing some kind of cat and mouse game, it turns them off to the point where you're not going to be able to make a difference. So starting from this place of befriending and feeling like you're on the same side and working together is really important. Then the next step is providing factual information. So a number of the facts that either of my colleagues presented tonight, you could just, again, in a non-judgmental way, sort of relay, look, I'm concerned about you and your health. I heard these are the facts that people have been telling me. I want to relay these to you. And then to get them to come up with the pros and cons for either why they would start vaping or remain a non-vapor, or if they're already vaping, what are the pros and cons of quitting? So really allow them to generate those ideas about why you would and why you wouldn't. And then, once they've gotten it out, and if people verbalize things themselves, they usually make a deeper psychological commitment to those things. So part of this is you not being the one to say the things, but really getting them to do it. Then you can provide positive feedback for the things that they've said that are pro-change. So you can say, yeah, I get it that you would be spending a lot of money if you started vaping and going to these new retail outlets. So that makes sense to me why you might not want to start. The next thing that you can do, and this especially is important if somebody is already dependent on a substance, is rehearse with them. So role play maybe, or talk it through with them, what they're going to do to implement their new behavior or make a behavior change when tough situations come up. So if they've said, I don't want to be one of those kids who's spending all my time vaping or figuring out how to hide vaping materials from you or whatever, then what are they going to do when it comes up in a social situation, or if they're feeling stressed and for some reason they think it's going to be a tension reducer? So talk it through with them so that they have a chance of rehearsing some of these. It's always important to offer more supports, especially if people are wrestling with some kind of dependence, and then looping back and repeating this a few times, because just one conversation usually isn't enough. And it takes multiple, what we call boosters, or multiple go-rounds in order for it to have an effect. So in addition to motivational interviewing, that style of talking to people, there are specific things that you can think about depending on where your own child is at. So if somebody hasn't yet tried vaping or alcohol, and you don't want them to, a basic is you model the behavior. So if you yourself are vaping, then you're going to need to address that and think about the message that that's sending to your kids. And they know a lot more than we think that they know, unfortunately. So even when we think that we're hiding things pretty well, they have their ways of figuring it out. So modeling the healthy behavior is important. I would say, as a parent, a lot of times you say, okay, I know I have to have the talk about vaping, and then, next week we have to have the talk about whatever the next issue is, and you want to have that talk and be able to cross it off your list. Coming back, not just thinking of it as a one-time event, but thinking of new and different ways to reintroduce the topic throughout a semester, throughout the year, and that could be bringing up news stories or talking about issues that their friends are having, or finding ways to bring in the topic however you can so that you keep the information alive and fresh. One thing you might think about doing is talking about, if they haven't started vaping, how they could be a bystander in their school or in the neighborhood, either if they have friends who are vaping or people that they're not friendly with who are vaping. Part of the reason for doing that, well, it's twofold. So first of all, it's great if people are bystanders and they're able to intervene with other people. It's also a way of getting them to be thinking of themselves in the driver's seat in terms of, I'm trying to convince other people not to vape, and it commits them even more to not doing it themselves. A few things for those who have already started or tried it. Mike talked a little bit about harm reduction. So this is a well-known strategy in public health. It's really successful. I think it's hard to think about as a parent because you just want to have absolutes and say absolutely not. While you're under my roof, there is no way, no how. But you do have another option, so it's just an option to put out there, which is to work with them to negotiate a safer way of doing what they have decided that they are going to do. And whether that means buying products that have less nicotine, or trying to get it down to 1 time a month instead of 4 times a month, or making sure that they promise you they will never do it at school, because that puts them at risk of suspension. These are all harm reduction ways of talking to the kids. Quit teams or having quit buddies is something that works well. And so even if you're not somebody who's vaping, if there's something that you are doing that either you wish you weren't doing, or maybe they wish you weren't doing, coming into their room without knocking or something like that, you can say this is a joint project and why don't we go into it together, and both have our sort of goals we're trying to accomplish, and that can work. One thing that is helpful to think about sometimes is that things that look like outright disobedience to parents are sometimes kids being as strategic as possible to make the best possible choice given all the different pressures that they're dealing with and the circumstances they're trying to navigate. So it's hard for us to remember back to being adolescents, but they're facing really complicated situations often with peer groups and their identity and how they're being seen. And there may be cases where somebody, they try vaping once, but it's in order to be able to say to kids later, oh, I tried it, it's not my thing, right? So we don't know that until we talk to them and we get at their logic, but standing in their shoes or asking them to help you see it from their perspective can sometimes just like lower the tension. The other thing is just drawing on some of the statistics that Rich relayed. The truth is that the majority of teenagers who try vaping will not go on to become addicted or dependent. 85% of those who use alcohol do not go on to develop alcohol problems. So recognizing that if you have no other choice but to sit it out and sit tight and wait, it is developmentally normal for adolescents to try drugs and alcohol and be curious, and sometimes the best that we can do is wait it out in those situations. If kids are dependent, and you know that, the one thing that I'll just mention here is that you should look into what the root cause or maybe why they're doing it. So we know that there are 3 reasons why people are motivated to use alcohol. The first one is for social camaraderie. And then the second one is to reduce tension, so to cope with problems. And the third one is to get a little boost, feel a buzz or feel some kind of mood enhancement. Interestingly, only the latter 2 are linked with any kind of development of unhealthy use. or misuse problems. So people who drink socially, just like maybe people who vape socially, are at lower risk. And we don't have evidence around this around vaping specifically, but we certainly do around alcohol. The reason for it, and if it's a social reason, may be less likely to lead to future unhealthy use. So that's worth figuring out. I asked a bunch of my colleagues and friends for their thoughts on this topic, so I just wanted to acknowledge them and say that I got some help in putting together these ideas. And then to say that I'm available and happy to talk further about these things if people are interested and want to be in touch. I'll end it there. Okay, thanks.
So at this time, we have about 15 minutes left. We're going to bring the first two speakers up and have them sit. We'll have a mic that, Danielle, I'm going to ask you if you can maybe man this side of the room with the microphone, so that if you have a question, we're going to get the mic over to you so that we can hear your question and so that it's preserved. So anybody want to, we had a first question back there. I'm sorry, I do want to get back to it. Danielle, can you get the microphone to the woman back there in the third row from the back? And we'll start with that one.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the talk. It was really informative. One of the things I'm kind of curious is if you know whether or not the FDA is going to, at any time in the near future, regulate these items.
So the FDA has asserted regulatory jurisdiction over electronic cigarettes, and they've actually issued regulations. So they are already regulating electronic cigarettes. Unfortunately, what the regulations do is they basically require companies to submit applications to the FDA in order to stay on the market. And in the applications, they have to report all the chemicals and the toxicology results, and it's incredibly burdensome, and most companies will not be able to do that. And so because the FDA's approach was so burdensome, the new FDA commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who was appointed shortly after the new president came into office, has suspended or delayed the implementation of those rules for 2 more years. So they wouldn't go into an effect until 2020, and instead is trying to look for other alternatives for regulating the product. What I believe is really needed is safety standards, that the agency should set safety standards. We know a lot of the things that would make electronic cigarettes safer. Things like proper labeling, like Rich mentioned, they need to be accurate in how much nicotine is in the product. Things like not having batteries explode. Things like not having temperature control, so the temperature does not go high enough that these carcinogens and chemicals are introduced. We have the technology, we know how to do it. The FDA, I believe, should be setting standards saying, here's what you need to do. So I'm working with several members of Congress now to try to get Congress to pass a law that would force the FDA to set safety standards. But unfortunately, as of right now, the FDA is essentially not doing anything. Even though they're formally regulating the product, nothing's really happening for the next 2 years. So I'm hoping to push Congress to force the FDA to actually set standards.
Okay, great. We have a question back here, Mr. Cummings.
Good evening, and thank you very much for coming. This was awesome. I have a question for Mike. You were up first, and it seemed like you didn't think it was such a bad idea that some of the e-cigarettes were okay, if not bad for you at all. I was wondering, except for juuling. Now, do you have any data to suggest what most kids are using? And does everything get watered down if most kids are juuling when you look at all the data combined?
So, unfortunately, we don't have data on what kids are using. We just don't have it. So we actually have no idea what percentage of kids are using Joule versus other e-cigarettes. And then of the other e-cigarettes, we have no idea what percentage of kids are using various types of e-cigarettes. We don't know the nicotine levels that kids are using. We don't know the devices that they prefer. We basically just don't know. This is also new, and it's kind of taken us by storm, that we just don't have any of that information. I actually have submitted a grant application to do surveys to get that information, but right now we just don't know. Yeah.
So I will just share my experience here in the building is that the spike in vaping that we've seen in the news has run entirely consistent with Joule devices that we're finding. So when we're finding kids, devices on kids, they're Joule devices. And my guess, and I mean, you're the scientist, I would guess, I would defer to you, but my guess is that whatever they're doing with the Joule device that is improving, I'll use that word loosely, but improving the delivery system for nicotine is making that device more addictive more quickly, and then making that device a device that our kids are becoming dependent on, and then that's what we're seeing here at school. So we used to see a few devices here and there. They were not Joule devices, they didn't exist. And then I think if you were to chart or track this giant spike and match it or overlay it with the introduction of the Joule, my guess is those two charts would be identical. That's just my guess.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Are you able to tamper with the Joule device to add additional drugs to it to make it more dangerous?
Not with the Joule, not with the Joule. So I think Rich mentioned that it's the third generation devices that you can tamper with. They're called open systems versus closed system. So a closed system is all these major brands that I mentioned, like Views, Mark 10, Blue, Logic, V2, and including Joule. They basically have cartridges that are closed, and you can't get in there to change the liquid that you put in it. However, the third generation devices, which are called open systems, you can actually access where you put the liquid in. So you could manipulate those to put anything you wanted in there. And that's why I kind of suggested that those third generation devices are more dangerous, because there's a lot less control over those. And those are the same devices that you actually can control the voltage. So with a Joule or a Blue or the typical e-cigarette, you can't change the voltage. It's all preset, and it's preset at a level that's not going to overheat the liquid. But when you get into these open systems, you can control the voltage. You can overheat it to the point where it's creating much more chemicals and carcinogens. So those are the systems that I think are most dangerous.
Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, in the Joule, is it just those two ingredients that you kept showing, or is there anything different in it that gives the kids that spike like a cigarette would? Or
So no, it's the ingredients are the same. It's propylene glycol, glycerin combination with some water and with the nicotine and the flavorings. Mm-hmm. What's different is that they're using a nicotine salt instead of what's called free nicotine. And it's that salt that is, for some reason, for chemical reasons, absorbed really quickly into the bloodstream. So it's not the ingredients that are different. It's not the other ingredients. It's the form of nicotine that makes it so so different.
Thank you.
Just a quick question, because I'm new to all this, and maybe there's another person in here that doesn't know this either. But when you buy an e-cigarette, is it like a package of them, or is it like just one cigarette and then you buy like refills for it? I don't know how that works.
Okay, so there's two ways you can purchase e-cigarettes. The first is what are called disposable e-cigarettes. And so those are e-cigarettes that have their own battery in them. And so you literally can buy one or two or three and just and just use them one time, and then they're disposable. You throw them out. The second type is what's called a rechargeable device. And those are devices where you buy the device and it's rechargeable. So you keep the device for as long as you want, and all you do is you put new cartridges in with the ELiquids. So you use one cartridge with one ELiquid, and when you're done, you would take that cartridge out and put a new one in the next time you wanted to use it. And then you keep recharging the device. So those are the two possibilities. And we don't know, or at least I don't know, what kids are mostly doing as to which one of those that they're doing more often. But those are the two possibilities. The age, so in Massachusetts, the age is 21. You're not allowed to buy any of these devices unless you're 21. How well that's being enforced, I have no idea, but that's the law. And actually in Westwood, Westwood has its own law that sets an age 21 limit as well. So the disposables are $3 or $4. They're really cheap. The chargeable devices are they start at about $20 and go up to, I've seen devices at $120. But it's only a one-time purchase because once you have the charger, you don't need to continue buying the charger. So it's maybe a $20 to $50 initial expense, and then the cartridges are $3 to $4 every time you want
so
to
just
fill
for
it.
reference, the item that was going around the room, that is about a $40 to $60 item. I looked it up before we came down here, and the pods that get swapped in and out are much, much less expensive and can be bought in packages of 4.
Sorry.
That was it. Sorry, to be clear, that is a Joule, the one that was going around.
Right.
My takeaway tonight is that there is a significant difference between e-cigarettes as a blanket statement and the Joule device. I think in 5 years, 2 years, we're going to be talking about Joules. Like, I think it will be synonymous with simply nicotine-addicted kids using an electronic device is a Joule device. I don't know. That's my prediction just by seeing that chart and how effectively it delivers this. The nicotine high and what we're seeing, that is consistent with what we're seeing with kids' behavior in the building.
Sorry, just to piggyback off the same questions. How does it work? Like, how long does it take to heat it up? And you said you couldn't smell anything, but it has these fruity flavors. Would that be an odor that would be on the kid as well? I guess just things to look for.
I'm sorry, the second part of the odor? Oh, okay. Yeah, so no, unfortunate, well, I don't know if it's fortunate or not, but no. Unlike smoking, smoking, it's really hard to hide. If someone had a cigarette, you can smell it in the breath, it stains your clothing, The e-cigarette aerosol doesn't typically have a smell, and so you really can't tell if someone, it would be very difficult to tell that someone's been vaping. There really aren't signs that you could tell. As far as how long it takes to heat the device, it's almost instantaneous. Once it's charged, you just press the button and boom, you're ready to inhale.
Okay.
So, which is a problem because kids can use it very quickly,
Sure.
and boom, you take it out, you inhale, you put it away, very quick.
So they could just take a hit and put it away. You don't smoke like a whole thing of it, like you would a cigarette, right? I guess.
Exactly. So it's not like a cigarette where if you don't smoke the cigarette, it's burning. Eventually, It's going to disappear. With a vape, it stays there, and every time you want to inhale it, you take an inhale. It's not going to go anywhere. So you could literally have one device and just keep it with you all day, and anytime no one's looking, you could just inhale. Or between classes, you could inhale, put it away, and then the next class, inhale.
I have a good friend who vapes, and there's a lot of stuff that comes out. So is that the third generation? Because sounds like the other ones are more discreet.
Yeah, so different vaping products produce different amounts of vapor, and what you're really seeing is the exhaled breath from the vapor that when you're seeing the aerosol. It's a little scarier than it looks because there have been studies and that aerosol dissipates very, very quickly. Unlike tobacco smoke, where, you know, when you exhale tobacco smoke, it stays in the room, it's not going anywhere for a long, long time. When you exhale the aerosol from e-cigarettes, it dissipates within a matter of really seconds. So there's not much of a concern of inhalation for the bystander unless you were in a room with a bunch of vapors. I've been at a conference where there are literally hundreds of people vaping in the same room, and you can smell it at that point. But unlikely that you would even know if someone was vaping in the room and you couldn't see them. It's not like you would smell anything.
I would respond to this gentleman's question. I think the question is, how do I know if my kid is vaping? What should I look for? What should I smell? And I think what we're learning and what we've seen here is it's a very discrete device. It's really hard to detect when it's happening. You almost have to look for behaviors that are consistent with kids who are vaping, not necessarily the vaping itself. So what we are looking for in the building, and we had a staff meeting last week where we talked about, I passed around that same vaping device, the Joule, and asked teachers to look for this device. If you see it, if a kid had it on their desk a year ago, nobody would have thought anything of that. It looks and charges on a USB port. It looks like a thumb drive. When I was looking for that singular device in my desk to come down here, it took me a few moments, and I know what it looks like, and I know what my desk looks like, but there's other thumb drives and other items in there. That's how discrete these items can be. And so what I would say is look for the behaviors. What we see in the building is kids going into the bathroom in clumps, kids asking to go to the bathroom in pairs. We've really set limits on those kind of behaviors that we think are consistent with vaping. Catching a kid in the exact act of vaping is really difficult. Here, I see that as a challenge here in our building, and I imagine that translates into every home where a child is vaping. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
answers it a little bit.
I'm glad you said that. If you're looking for the occasional vaping, it's hard to find and see. But I do want to go back to the point that nicotine is addictive, and just like any other drug, if you're physically dependent on it, and especially a short-acting drug like nicotine, you need it frequently. And so what you look for is things that are signs that the person is going to use. They have to go use it somewhere. They're disappearing to their room, or they're going outside, or they're going somewhere to pull the thing out and use it. And so it's those kinds of things that you might be looking for.
Yeah, and as a parent, we had a speaker last year, and they were talking a little bit about one of the healthier questions to ask is not only is my kid vaping, or if you find out that they are, why are they doing it? And I think you touched on that, Emily, which was what are the things they're doing what are they getting out of it? Is it stress reduction? There are certain reasons why they're doing these behaviors, and often they transcend peer pressure. There's a reason why they're doing this behavior, and to try to drill down and figure out what is driving that behavior that is disturbing and distressing is a good question to ask. The question was, how many puffs do they get on one cartridge?
So each part, typically you get between 100 and 150 puffs per cartridge. I've seen people, yeah, and it's the equivalent of, essentially, I've seen people get 200 puffs, they've told me, the really experienced vapors, but typically it's between 100 and 150 puffs. And there is a skill level involved in it. You can actually become a good vapor. You know, I've never heard of someone being a good smoker or a bad smoker, but you can actually, there are skill levels with vaping. You can get better and better at it.
Professor Siegel, do I understand that the amount of tobacco in one Joule pod, which is 150 or so puffs, is equivalent to one pack of cigarettes?
Exactly. Usually each cartridge is the equivalent of a pack of cigarettes.
Of nicotine.
Exactly. And that's why it's so cheap, because a pack of cigarettes in Massachusetts these days is about $13, but a cartridge or a pod you can get for $3, $4. So it's actually a lot cheaper, which I think is part of why youth are able to afford it.
And Rich, maybe you can speak to the effects of nicotine on the brain, and that is certainly something that I think is really a critical component. We've touched on a bit, but haven't really focused heavily on.
There's a lot more animal data than people data on nicotine alone. I think it's safer to just say that we're talking about developing brain. And for developing brain, any effect on this reward pathway affects those areas that I mentioned, like motivation and executive function, control, self-control, learning. And we know a lot more about other drugs like alcohol and how it affects that pathway, but all the addictive drugs affect that pathway the same way, and we should leave it at that.
I think maybe we have time for one more question, and then we can bring people up if you don't mind taking more like individualized questions.
Really quick question. Is there any test that we could buy in a CVS that could detect if the kids have Jouled?
So the only way to detect that would be to do a cotinine test, which would require a urine sample. I don't know of any covert way to do this. I mean, I suppose you could go into the bathrooms after. I don't know. No, there really isn't. I mean, you would have to have a biological test like a urine cotinine test. Yeah.
So I'd love to maybe end with each one of you, if you can just have one takeaway for parents on one thing that they can maybe do differently or do in their home to tomorrow. What might that be? Maybe we'll start with you, Emily.
So I was just sitting here thinking, well, if you want to know if your child is vaping, radical idea, but you could ask them. And I know, right? So, and the other piece of it, I think, is when we get ourselves into those modes where it is that sort of policing and cat and mouse and playing cop kind of game with them, it kind of goes downhill from there, is what the research suggests. So building a rapport where